Hey, Kermit Weeks here, Fantasy of Flight, and I'm going to do something I've been meaning to do for a long time. I apologize it's taken us so long. I'm going to do a little bit of a tour through the short Sunderland. I have not been in this airplane in so long. But anyway, I'm sitting here with Fantasy of Flight in the background. I want to point it out. I had purchased the airplane prior to or while we were designing Fantasy of Flight, and I just wanted to point it out that this hangar here, the biggest hangar I've got at Fantasy of Flight, we call this the North Hangar, because the south hangar is down here. And basically this hangar here, part of the design of this hangar was because of the Sunderland. The height of the hangar was actually decided based on the tops of the propellers to get the Sunderland in. And that little cutout up there, there's a little roll-up door that goes up and down, and that was specifically included for the Sunderland. The hangar width is a lot wider than the Sunderland needs to be, but the hangar width was kind of basically determined on the biggest wingspan airplane I had at the time, which is a B-29. I believe it's 141 feet. So anyway, so this is where the Sunderland kind of houses. At some point we're going to do a seaplane base, kind of a Pan Am Clipper style seaplane base down at the lake. You know, Fantasy of Flight's going to be developed out over in this big open field. Down here we're going to do a seaplane base, and eventually we'll have to have a hangar to get it in and out of that basically has those attributes. So here's the Sunderland, and I want you to cut me a little bit of slack because I have not been in this airplane in a very long time. The last time it flew, we did the Olympic torch relay in 1996 to the Atlanta Games. I was the longest leg of the relay, and we flew down to Sarasota. They ran the torch through the city. They brought it out in a police boat, and we had it inside. When it's in an airplane, like when they bring the torch over from Athens, Greece, and stuff for the Olympics, it's in a little it's in a container that has a flame, but it has 3 separate little units in it. Picked up the torch in Sarasota, flew 200 miles back to Miami. We landed at the Miami City Hall, which was the original Pan Am Clipper base on Dinner Key in Coconut Grove. I am the last person to fly a 4-engine flying boat into the original Pan Am Clipper base. That's pretty cool. It might go on my tombstone. Anyway, and I want to mention too that occasionally I get some comments, oh, you know, it's sitting out, you know, Kermit, the airplane's rotting. Well, let me tell you something. You have no idea what it costs to keep these airplanes going and to house them and everything. And I am the longest owner in the history of this airplane to keep this airplane inside. And basically, it flew during the war with 3 different countries, starting with the British, the Canadians. I believe it finished up with the Norwegian Air Force. The airplane was flown down to New Zealand. It was flown out of Auckland in the New Zealand Air Force, actually, believe it or not. And then eventually, one of the airplanes that Ansett Flying Boats was flying out of Rose Bay they lost it in a storm, flying out to Lord Howe Island, which was halfway between Sydney and you know, I think it was about halfway to New Zealand. And eventually, the demise of the flying boat was they built a runway on Lord Howe Island, and so this particular airplane was purchased by Ansett Flying Boats as a replacement for the one that they lost, which was actually a Sandringham. Okay, they didn't actually build Sandringhams at the Belfast Shorts factory in Ireland. But basically, after the war, there was a lot of surplus Sunderlands, and they converted the military Sunderlands to the Sandringham, okay? And it had a full passenger double deck. We'll see inside when we get in there. But this airplane was originally a wartime airplane, dropped depth charges, supplies, delivered, you know, looking for enemy submarines, picking up downed pilots. Unfortunately, since this airplane is considered a Sunderland by the FAA, I cannot fly passengers for compensation or hire. When Charlie Blair purchased the airplane from Ansett Flying Boats, Charlie Blair was a famous Pan Am captain, and he bought the 2 airplanes that they had, one of the Sandringham and this pseudo Sunderland here. And they basically, he flew them both back, and he was going to use them in the Caribbean, and the FAA said he couldn't fly passengers in this one. So unless I can get some sort of a special waiver from the Schwartz factory that I'm a conversion specialist, and we call this a Sandringham. We're not going to be able to fly passengers. So anyway, and I really, to me, would we want to restore it as a Sunderland? To me, that's the way the airplane was originally done, but to me, the importance of the history of the flying boats was the romance, the adventure of the passenger service. So at a minimum, we're just going to leave it like this. You can see it's still got the bulge nose where it had a gun turret up on the front. It's got kind of the early Sunderland windshield. The Sandringhams had a little more curved ones. They did some conversions. These are basically PBY QECs. Original airplanes up through the Sunderland 1 through 3 or 4, they had Bristol Hercules engines in them. And are you ready for this? A 16-hour patrol bomber with non-feathering propellers. Whew. Anyway, somebody got the bright idea. They did a factory, and they did a I think a factory, and they did a field conversion. They basically put PBY Catalinas, which the British were using, QECs on the airplane, and then all of a sudden they had feathering propellers. Really kind of made it the great airplane that it became. Like I said, this particular airplane, is one of 2 Sunderlands, I believe, the only ones ever to have completely flown around the world, because the rest of them would have gone down, via through Europe and Africa and Asia, to the war thing, but none of them continued around except for this particular one and the Sandringham that is now the sister ship to this is in the Southampton Museum in southern England on the Solent. Anyway, let's see. We'll start here a little bit up in the front. There's a couple of ways to tow this. Airplane can obviously only fly in the water. The beaching gear here is only to get it in and out of the water. The hangar, I've got my own seaplane ramp down there on our little lake down there. And so to pull it forward, you basically use this big hook here connected to the hull. And there you can see a way that we connect for the anchoring. To anchor it when it's in the water, there's a big, I don't know what the hell you call it on a boat, where you wrap the rope around it. Anyway, these 2 little things on the side here, I'm going to explain when I get inside. Those are actually for a drogue chute, which I'll explain when we get inside. So basically, the beaching gear here, normally, when it was originally built and it came out, it had some flotation stuff that was around here, probably cork or something like that, and it was wrapped around in a fabric and stuff. Well, that's all since long deteriorated on these things here. Fortunately, when we brought this thing over from England, the airplane, after Charlie Blair got killed in a goose accident in the Caribbean, the airplanes eventually languished for a while. This particular one was purchased by publishing heir Edward Hulton. He bought it. He wasn't even a pilot, but he thought it was a great aerial yacht, and he used to fly it around. And thank God, he saved it. Eventually, the airplane came up for sale. It's really kind of an albatross around somebody's neck. If you don't have a place to operate it, you have to have a lake. When I built Fantasy of Flight, I had 3 requirements that I was looking for. One, I wanted enough land for a 5,000-foot runway so I could get the bigger airplanes in, like some of the bombers, P-51s and stuff. I also wanted great tourist access because I'm actually, halfway between Tampa and Orlando. When I first moved here, I was in the middle of nowhere. Now I find myself in the middle of everything, so that's a positive. And the last thing was key to this, and I wanted water access to fly vintage seaplanes in their natural environment. If you think about it, I don't think there's anywhere in the world where there is a seaplane museum where they still fly seaplanes in their natural environment. Granted, you've got a couple of places like Foynes in Ireland where the Pan Am Clippers used to land there. They got a museum, but they don't fly any airplanes. So anyway, so what we do now, I was very fortunate when I bought this in England, we had 2 sets of beaching gear, so we obviously had to keep one over in England while we were moving it around and stuff. we had shipped one over. I bought the airplane in about this is stretching it. Fantasy Flight opened in 1995, and I purchased the airplane, I believe, in 1995, 1994, somewhere in there. It took me several years to get the permit to put in my seaplane ramp. I don't even want to go there with all the regulations and finding Indian arrowheads. And anyway, so we finally put the ramp in there. We flew the airplane over. It was 1994. It was the first year we brought it over to Oshkosh. It was a 33-hour trip, I believe, about the same as Lindbergh. And but we had gone from we went from southern England at Calshot. We went to Ireland, we went to Killaloe. It was on the Loch Derg or something like that. I can't remember exactly. But anyway, so we landed there, fueled up, went up to Reykjavik, Iceland. The winds weren't favorable for us to fly all the way across, even though it's got a 16-hour range. We wanted to make sure that you know, everything was okay, and the winds weren't looking good about 2 weeks before we left. And I flew up to Iceland, found out it used to be a Sunderland base. They still had a buoy just south of the Reykjavik airport. So I arranged for customs and fuel and all that stuff. Think about it. When we brought this across the Atlantic, we went from southern England to Ireland to Iceland to Goose Bay, Canada, then Toronto Island Airport, then into the United States at Oshkosh. Pretty much every place I landed was a different country. I had to arrange for customs. I had to understand what the water depths were. Was there a buoy, you know, where you could land? And then the other thing is I had to figure out how I was going to fuel the thing, because you can't just pull it up to the gas pumps. Although, in effect, that's kind of what we did. And I'll explain that maybe a little bit later. So what we do now is we basically just strap, we get some you know, some not tie wraps, but you know, ratchet straps that we use for shipping and stuff. And we just wrap a bunch of 5-gallon cans around this. It works just fine. And basically, there's 3 pins. Basically, there's a pin up there that comes out. Okay, there is a pin right here that comes out. Okay, and then there's a pin back here. So it's real simple to come in and out. As you can see, if you needed to, you could rotate this thing around and move it to, you know, it looks like 1, 4, 12 different locations possibly, or 16 maybe. Anyway, how you could rotate it around, you could move it sideways, you could move it straight ahead. This is pretty much the way we move it here. And then there's a little tail wheel dolly in the back there where we steer it with, okay? So what we would do is, once we put this thing in the water, we would basically float it out to the, you know, actually, it's really interesting. I hope I can include some video here. But what we do when we put this in the water, we tow it down to the seaplane ramp, and we put it down. There's also there's also a hook on the back here that we can use to tow it. Obviously, you can't tow it. This would just be for steering. And we have a couple of straps over here where the guys can steer it and they can stand out here and look. This would be the place where we actually tow it if we're going to pull it this way. Okay. And it's interesting. What we do when we put this thing in the water is we get a tractor and we pull it down to the top of the ramp where it just starts to have a slope, okay? And we chalk it, and then we basically hook up to this little system back here a tractor, another tractor, okay? So it's like I'm sitting back here, you know, with this tractor here, and we've got it connected to that. And what happens is, you know, we've got this thing at the top of the ramp, and what we'll do is, or what I do is, I'll start engine number 1, and I'll start engine number 4, okay? And then what'll happen is, once they get warmed up and stuff, this guy on the back here basically gets the tractor and pulls the airplane back slightly so we can pop the chocks up in the front. And then we'll go very, very, very slowly. We'll tow the airplane down. Of course, I've got the, you know, the engines back at idle, 1 and 4, the outboards. And once the wheels touch the water line at the on the ramp there, there's a guy out there that goes like this. The guy in the tractor basically moves forward, okay, slackens the line, and this thing is almost like a glider release, okay? So up in the cockpit, I got a big handle up there, and I pull that thing, it releases this, and then I basically taxi into the water with the beaching gear on it, and we go ahead and moor it, and then at some point we basically, you know, end up, you know, taking the beaching gear off. Let's see, anything back here. Used to be a tail turret. Of course, the controls are fabric. And like I said, this thing was converted for passenger use, so it's got an upstairs, downstairs, where before this was pretty much a big open deal in the back there, except for the flight deck. So up here, if you look, you see there's like a little loop that comes down and goes like that up there at the top. So the 3 pins come out. There's a block and tackle with, you know, ropes go up twice, so there's a little bit of leverage. And you basically pull that up, and when you drop this thing off, or you want to put it on there, you basically use the block and tackle, which connects to this little thing on the side of the beaching gear there, and then you would lower that in the water. The tires actually have some flotation, as well as the, you know, the cans or whatever used to be on here before. This is kind of what it used to look like before. I don't know if it's cork or it's probably cork. It feels pretty light, and it's just got some heavy fabric on it and glued or whatever. So that's basically what used to be wrapped around here, but that stuff's all since deteriorated, and we just find something simple. So anyway, so we would drop that off, and you basically, it floats, and we would basically tow that with a little small motorboat, and I'm going to explain that. It was really pretty cool what we had. We had a, I think it was about like an 8-foot inflatable thing with a little outboard on the back, and we used to get so much use out of that. We would just tow that thing back into the ramp, and then once it's on the ramp and you pull it up like this, it's got the wheels, you come in with a forklift, you just pick it up and you just tow it, kind of like a trailer. So anyway, so that's that. I'm trying to think anything special here. You know, fixed floats, Catalina QECs, Hamilton Standard propellers. So they're basically, it's like a DC-3 engine or a PBY engine. There's that. Like I said, I have not been up here in so long. So let me see if I can even remember what's going on. Yeah, so let me tell you something. You have no idea what it's like owning something like this and having it out on the water. You're worried about wind, you're worried about weather, you're worried about, is it going to bust loose from the mooring? Before we got here, I had poured a chunk, a 5,000-pound chunk of concrete with rebar in it, and we had it set, you know, for a mooring buoy. You got boaters, you know, gawking around it. You know, we've had kids break in, steal fire extinguishers. You know, just anyway, you're worried about the float switches operating properly, or the batteries charged, because sometimes it takes on a little bit of water and stuff. Anyway, somebody literally, when they were in the war, it was a 24/7 watch. Somebody always stayed on the boat. Okay, that's not feasible here. So it just adds to the frustration and the you know, the dilemma of owning it. Anyway, it's a little bit of scene out this way, and this is kind of the scene you kind of see from the cockpit. So anyway, so we're going to go in here, and like I said, we used to have a I think it was about an 8-foot boat, blow-up boat that we couldn't get through the door. But what we would do is we would store it here, half inflated, basically inflated to where we could get it in and out of the door. And we actually, it was pretty cool, and we had the little motor. It was probably a, I don't know, 10 or 12 horsepower motor or something. And it was so cool because we got it to where when we'd land, okay, I'd land the airplane, and we'd start slowing down, let the engines wind down a little bit, you know, cool off. I would shut the inboards down. Okay, you see the other inboard over here, number 3. Okay, so I'd shut the inboards down, and to taxi and get the airplane up to the mooring buoy, This airplane has no brakes, has no reversible propellers, it has no water rudder, okay? So the only way you can steer this is through differential power on the engines, or basically sailing the airplane by using the ailerons and the rudders, you know, to create drag, to drag a wing back, which is really slow, but it works, and I'll explain that when I get up in the cockpit, how we actually moor this thing. And so, anyway, so we actually got to where we would get to a place, and, you know, of course, we're landing in a different country, and, you know, somebody's got to go figure out what's going on, and we're here, and where's the customs, and make sure we're doing everything right. So anyway, so my flight engineer would actually, after I got the inboards shut down, we would actually he'd get the boat out here, stuff it through the thing half inflated, pump the thing up while we're underway, okay? He'd get the little motor put on it, he would get it going, and he would take off, and he'd go talk to the people before we ever shut the engines down on the buoy. I mean, we had it down pat, it was pretty cool. And the British guys, when we brought this thing over, we had a legal, well, what we did, we had 3 Brits, and we had 3 Americans, okay? So Ken Emmett was the legal captain, and he had actually done the first 2 test flights over there, and the first time I'd ever been in the airplane. And that was in, you know, in England in 1994, and oh my God, the last one, he crashed it on, and I thought, oh my God, what have I got myself into? I got in this thing, and you know, other than the fact that there's a lot of torque when you start pushing the power up on the engines, and it tends to dig the left float in there, other than the fact that initially, and when I get in the cockpit, I'll explain this, you can't actually see where the horizon is because it's got a curved panel and there's nothing to compare it to. So anyway, so Ken Emmett he did the first 2 flights in the left seat, and then I was in the right seat. Then he threw me in the left seat, and I flew the airplane the rest of the way other than cruising. I did all the takeoffs and the landings and stuff. And there's a little bit of a fin on the bottom of the airplane, and I got to where I would come in and land. It was so smooth, you couldn't even tell when I touched the water. This little fin would sit down, and it would just kind of like go in the water, and it would be so smooth anyway. So that was pretty cool. So Ken Emmett was the legal captain. I was the legal co-pilot, although I did all the flying from the left seat. We had Peter Smith was the legal flight engineer for, no, Peter Smith was a mechanic. He was like Peter Smith was the guy that maintained the airplane. And my guy, Jack McCloy, worked for me. He was my AI for a long time when Fantasy of Flight opened. He was the American counterpart to Peter, you know, heading up the maintenance from our side, working with Peter. And then Jeff Masterton, I believe his name was, he was the legal flight engineer, because you have to have 3 legal people to fly this airplane. You have to have a pilot, you have to have a co-pilot, you have to have a flight engineer, but you really need 4 because you have to have a bowsman. Somebody basically has to pick up and knock the buoy off and all that kind of stuff. So Jeff Masterton was the bowsman or the flight engineer, and my counterpart to learn how to be the flight engineer was Russ Lang, and unfortunately Russ and Jeff are no longer with us. So this is basically how you get in and out of the hatch here. I'm going to have to do a little bit of, there we go. So that holds that up there so I don't bust my head. Okay, so up here we've got ropes, and basically this here is a drogue. That is basically a water parachute. There's one on the right, there's one on the left, there's the other one right there. They certainly look like they need to be replaced. This would be for, you know, anchor line and that kind of stuff. But the drogues sit up here, they connect up here. So what happens is, there's the, I still can't remember what the hell you call those things. It's where you hook the things like on a boat. This is like a boat. Okay, so there's the port side. There's the pilots up there, starboard side, because it's a boat. okay? And so basically, this guy up here would be used to pick up the buoy, you know, drop it, you know, when we're about to start. And what happens is when I go to start, because there's no brakes, there's no steering except differential throttle and the wind, what you always do here is you always start the engine closest to the shore, okay? So what happens is by doing that, as soon as you start that, not only is the airplane start moving, but it's turning as well. So basically, you know, you're turning and you're moving as soon as the first engine starts. So if the shoreline was over here, I would start that engine first, okay, number 4. I would start number 4, and once it got started, the guy would release the buoy up here, okay? And then now what we're trying to do is we're trying to get number 1 started, because if 1 won't start and we come around, we're heading back towards the shore and we've got a problem, then all of a sudden we're gonna have to shut this one down. We generally have a boat out here, you know, from a safety point of view, or we can shut something down. This guy up here, he can drop an anchor or whatever. And maybe when I get up in the cockpit, I'll explain how we actually moor the thing. So this is basically a little thing. Originally there was a turret, a gun turret up here. I think I had a couple of 303s. The Brits like 30 calibers or 303s. Anyway, so a lot of storage up here. That's our anchor. You know, storage back here. Boy, this thing is so small compared to the Martin Mars. Anyway, so here we got a little bit of a lavatory, okay? There used to be a toilet in here. I don't know what happened to it. Whatever, somebody took it out. Anyway, that's what a Sunderland captain looks like. It's been a while. Okay, so anyway, so this is like a little galley down here, and originally this wasn't in here as a Sunderland. This was all converted by Ansett flying boats. Got a little bit of club seating here, kind of the airline deal. No smoking, fasten seatbelts. And what happened was Ansett in Rose Bay, Sydney, Australia, they basically converted this to this and used it. Oh no, wait a second. There's the lab back there. So what is this? Oh, this is just a powder room or something, and for storage, or maybe that's for the ladies. Anyway, at some point there was a lab in here somewhere. So we got a little bit of sink here. You know, you got emergency exits here where you can actually get, well, whatever, in and out. This is the little galley, okay? So we got coffee and things like that we can store and all that kind of stuff. There's a little thing here, the bilging diagram. Unfortunately, at my age, I tend to bilge a little more than I would like to. This here is going to be the downstairs way to, oh, how about that? Look at that. I was wrong. The women get the bigger one. Whatever happened to potty parity? So this is going to go up to the cockpit, but before we get up there, we're actually going to look at the rest of this in the back here. So this was converted, and this airplane at some point could actually carry 36 passengers. Okay, some of these have been taken out. And that's looking forward. You know, this has all been kind of nicely done with some fresh air and lights and things like that. And you know, we took the seats out for some reason. I remember what the reason was, and I'll explain when I get upstairs. So here's an actual upstairs. This is a little bit, the concept is similar in the Sandringham, but I think they actually had like almost like a little spiral staircase here. It's been a long time since I went in one. So in the back here, here's the tail. That would have been very military looking. And there would have been a tail turret back there with a, I think it might have been, there was at least 2, if not 4 303s. I can't remember. These here are actually ladders and work stands to work on the engine. You got to realize, if you want to work on the engine in this thing, in the water, let me tell you, you better tie all your wrenches to a string, okay? Because if you drop one, it is gone. These little things here are actually stands that go outside the engines, and the leading edge of the airplane outside of the engines, they actually disconnect they fold down into a level deal. You've actually got work stands on both sides of the engines to work on, and then these things connect to go down even further. That goes in the front of the propeller, so you can actually sit there and work on the propeller governor, the prop, and that kind of stuff. And they actually, I believe they actually had a hoist where you could actually change an engine in the water. So anyway, so this is kind of the back end. Here's my glider release. In case I want to tow gliders. No, this is actually for disconnecting, for when I, disconnect the cable for launching the boat. Okay, so this is the back end. Man, this is so small compared to the Martin Mars. Let me tell you, man, the Martin Mars is off the chart stupid. Only major governments sponsor those things, okay? Either the U.S. Navy or the Canadian Forestry Service are basically paying for them, okay? A private guy to own a Martin Mars is just not even in the cards. This is a practical 4-engine flying boat. I'm just saying. We used to have this open for not tours, but it was open for people to come in at Fantasy of Flight. And so we have a little bit of a fan here to keep the circulation going. Okay, we got a little door back here where we can get out. A rear entrance. Okay, so now we're going up into the upper little deck here. And as you can see, we're missing things here. It's a little bit ratty. It's a little bit torn up. We got a little bit of a bar here. This here is actually a way, we actually closed this off and put a little clear thing there where we can look up, because when we did have this open for the public for Fantasy of Flight, we did not allow people to go up in the cockpit unless we controlled it. So we allowed people to walk around through here. A little bit of a bartender. I mean, it's not fancy, but at the time it was probably neat. So we had it open for quite some time. Unfortunately, we had a local Boy Scout troop, if you can believe it, come in here. They ripped all this stuff out. They were just frickin', anyway, they were pulling stuff. Anyway, the bottom line is we shut it down after that. So it was too sad, but, unfortunately, sometimes that's just what happens. I'm not sure what these ropes are for, but anyway, they're for something. Maybe, I don't know what those are for. Anyway, maybe for, I don't know what it is. But anyway, upstairs here, okay, you've got an emergency exit. And I don't know how much of this was actually added with Ansett flying boats. I don't believe those would have been in there as a Sunderland. So anyway, so this is basically the upstairs. Okay, so now we're going to go back down. We're going to get up into the cockpit. Okay, like I said, this all got crunched. We've got float switches under here. There's different, obviously there's different, what do you call them? Bulkheads, so if you got a leak somewhere, it wouldn't be, too traumatic. It would hopefully stop the leak somewhere. Okay, so this is how we get up to the flight deck. I have not been up here in so long.